Welcome to the first video in the Unit 8 series. This video is going to explore topic 8.1, Responses to the Environment. As a field of biology, ecology incorporates studies from a number of other scientific fields, some of which are biologically based, but it also includes a bit of geology and chemistry. Since ecology is the study of how organisms interact with one another and their environment, factors within the environment can have a dramatic effect on how those organisms behave. Some of those factors include feeding behaviors, movement, migration, and how they orient themselves within their environment, their courtship and mating rituals, how they grow and develop, and also their level of activity. As environmental conditions fluctuate, those fluctuations affect how an organism behaves and how it functions physiologically. Things such as the availability of water, what the temperature is like outside, and how much daylight there is affect that physiology and behavior. Probably some of the easiest observations we can make that help support that claim are the kinds of changes that we observe as we progress through the different seasons of the year. As we progress from spring to summer to fall to winter and then back to spring again, we can easily observe changes that happen to plants, and then of course changes that happen to plants are going to affect animals as well. As the Earth revolves around the sun, those seasonal changes can be marked As the Earth revolves around the sun, we can use those seasonal changes to make predictions about how animals are going to both behave and function. But before we take a look at how those seasons affect organisms' physiology and behavior, let's take a look at what causes those seasons in the first place. It all boils down to the fact that the Earth is tilted on its axis relative to its orbital plane. So as we make our year-long journey around the sun, the angle at which the sun's rays strike the Earth's surface also varies. At some times of the year in the northern hemisphere, the sun's rays are striking the Earth at a much steeper angle, resulting in a much larger area over which that radiant energy is distributed. That means that per unit of area, there is less energy available at this steeper angle than if it was at a much more perpendicular angle. So when we look at the orbit of the Earth around the sun in total, because of that angle, we can see that in December, at that much steeper angle, there is actually less energy per unit of area distributed over the Earth's surface. Days are colder, there's less sunlight available per 24-hour period. Trees go into a situation where they shed their leaves, at least deciduous ones do, and that also triggers changes in animals as well. Of course, 6 months later, when the sun's rays are striking the Earth in the northern hemisphere at a more perpendicular angle, we experience more sunlight per 24-hour period, and of course, the temperature is much warmer in June than it is in December. Now, because there are physiological changes taking place in plants, that directly affects animals as well. Not just herbivores, but also the omnivores and carnivores that rely on those herbivores. Because of the temporary loss of food and maybe even a habitat, that drives different kinds of animals to behave in a way that they may migrate to find food sources, or because of a lack of food, they may go into a condition of reduced metabolism. The annual year-long changes that are associated with seasonal changes are not the only ones that affect organisms' physiology and behavior. Another cycle, called the circadian rhythm, is based on a 24-hour process rather than a year-long process. The term circadian comes from the Latin for circa, meaning approximately, and diem, meaning day. So approximately every 24 hours, animals, plants, and even fungi and bacteria go through physiological changes that regulate their metabolism. For animals, it also helps to regulate our sleep and wake cycles. When we observe the kinds of changes that take place, nearly all of them can be traced back to the availability of light. The availability of light influences the cyclical production of things like neurotransmitters, as well as hormones and other biological molecules. It's those molecules then that influence how the organism behaves. In plants, for example, we may observe that they open and close their blooms, opening them when pollinators are available and closing them when they're not. We can also observe that some plants will actually raise and lower their leaves, raising them when the sun is available to capture the radiation from the sun to do photosynthesis, and lowering them when it's not. At the cellular level within plants, we can even observe how the availability of light affects how they open and close their stomata. You may remember when we learned about photosynthesis that stomata are the small pores on the bottom surface of most leaves that allow for gas exchange to occur, oxygen out and carbon dioxide in. Well, when photosynthesis is not taking place because of the unavailability of light, those stomata are closed. These cells, called guard cells, have photosensitive receptors that detect the presence of light and will therefore open or close the stomata appropriately. However, when the sun is rising, those photosensitive receptors detect that availability of light and begin to open the stomata so that gas exchange can resume. Humans, of course, are no exception to the cyclical nature of the circadian rhythm. We can take a look at this diagram here and see some of the most common behaviors and physiological changes that take place within that 24-hour cycle. We can say, for example, start here and see that we reach our deepest sleep not long after midnight, our body temperature decreases a few hours later, and as we progress through the day, we see some of the more common physiological changes and behaviors that take place, like when we're most alert, when we have our best coordination and fastest reaction time. The circadian rhythm is not just observed in diurnal organisms, the ones that are active during the day, but it's also observed in nocturnal organisms, ones that are most active at night. This diagram here shows some of the differences between the behavior and physiology of nocturnal and diurnal organisms. Nocturnal organisms tend to have very poor, if any, color vision. They communicate mostly by sound rather than vision. And it probably goes without saying, but nocturnal animals, although they can't see color very well, they have fantastic night vision. They include things like owls and bats and some of the larger cats like leopards. The seasonal changes in light availability and solar radiation and the resulting changes in temperature throughout the year affect the water cycle as well as global wind patterns. When the water cycle and global wind patterns are affected, that also results in alterations to precipitation patterns. We can observe virtually any location on the surface of the Earth and find that at certain points in the year, precipitation is more likely, and at other points, it's less likely. From an animal's perspective, that may drive the need to migrate in search of sources of fresh water. For plants, this may mean that they're more likely to produce offspring during certain times of the year or to germinate seeds during certain times as well. Probably one of the best known examples of a migratory event is called the Great Migration that takes place in the Serengeti. This Great Migration involves literally millions of organisms, hundreds of thousands of zebra and gazelle, and close to 2 million wildebeest that migrate in search of fresh water. This migration, though, of course, is not just based on water need, but also food. As those grazing animals are searching for food, carnivores are searching for food as well. Temperature is another influential factor on an organism's physiology and behavior. Not only do organisms respond to those long-term seasonal fluctuations in temperature, but they also do so to short-term daily fluctuations as well. For some organisms, though, like mammals and birds, endothermic organisms tend to not have as much of a response to temperature fluctuations. Since we maintain an internal temperature regardless of the external environment, we're less affected by those changes in temperature. But for ectothermic organisms like amphibians and reptiles, because their body temperature is directly correlated with what the ambient environmental temperature is like, they tend to be more active and have a higher metabolism during the day when it's warmer than they would when it's cooler. Many animals respond to temperature extremes by going into a reduced metabolic state with minimal physical activity. This coma-like condition that takes place in the wintertime is referred to as hibernation, and if it takes place in the summertime, is called estivation. Hibernating animals tend to do so because food is scarce, but mainly because the temperature is simply too cold. Estivating animals in the summertime do so because the temperature is simply too warm. Another form of this process, called torpor, is something that takes place generally on a much smaller time scale, such as within a 24-hour period, and is commonly found in birds. We're first going to take a look at animal communication, not because animals are more important than other forms of life, but because animal communication is definitely the most complex. Animals communicate with one another for a variety of reasons: to find mates, to identify food sources, and even to establish and assert dominance over territory. Perhaps one of the most critical forms of animal communication involve courtship behaviors. Courtship behaviors are those by which animals attract mates so that they can combine their genes with and reproduce. Oftentimes, these courtship behaviors are visual displays. They're there to show off their worthiness for reproduction. You can see there in the video clips playing that birds are very well known for producing some of the most elaborate courtship displays in the animal kingdom, but mammals as well, and even cephalopods, like this cuttlefish, will engage in behaviors to try and attract mates. For some species, the act of giving gifts, such as a gift of food, or maybe a small pebble, is a form of communication to display one's willingness to produce an offspring. For some animals, their success relies on their ability to assert dominance over other individuals. This may be a territorial dominance or a dominance over potential mates within the group. In order to assert that dominance and control, they will engage in what's called agonistic behavior. This agonistic behavior is intended to get any would-be challengers to back down prior to any actual harm being caused. Although animal communication is certainly the most conspicuous and varied, as I mentioned earlier, communication also takes place within plants, fungi, and even bacteria. Many kinds of plants, for example, when they're damaged either by insects or perhaps some pathogen, they'll release compounds into the atmosphere or into the soil that travel through fungal networks to warn other plants of the potential danger. So in this illustration here, we can see a plant that's been damaged by aphids and has released volatile organic compounds into the atmosphere. When other neighboring plants detect that chemical, they in turn will respond by producing chemical compounds that will repel those aphids. Bacterial communication has been studied for years. They can regulate the activities of the group through a process called quorum sensing. In quorum sensing, bacteria will release chemical compounds or even electrically charged particles into the environment, which then induces neighboring bacteria to regulate gene expression. This helps them to coordinate their activities so that they can increase or decrease growth or even produce structures called biofilms that help to improve their survivability. More often than not, how an animal behaves is literally a matter of life and death. An organism's behavior can increase or decrease its own survivability and also the survivability of a larger group. We categorize behaviors into one of two generalized types. The first type is called innate behavior. You can think of innate behavior as that instinctive behavior. It's built in genetically to how that organism functions. It's not influenced by environmental factors, and there's very low variability within a species. In other words, we tend to find all members of that species behaving in generally the same way when it comes to innate behaviors. Some great examples of innate behaviors are spiders spinning webs, caterpillars making cocoons, and dolphins leaping from the water. Those are all things that are built in to how those organisms function and survive. The second kind of behavior is called learned behavior. Now, the biological definition of learning is a modification of behavior based on past experiences. So those experiences could be an experience that an individual organism actually has itself, or through observing other individuals engaging in a particular behavior. Learned behaviors can include how you train your dog to give you a high five, how fish know to come to the surface of water to get fed, or how chimpanzees learn to use tools to fish for termites in wood. One example of a behavior that I like to use to differentiate between innate and learned is human language. Our ability to form sounds to communicate with other humans is an innate behavior. The physiology of our vocal cords, our brain, teeth, and tongue are what allow us to form the variety of sounds that we use to communicate with one another. Which language we use to communicate with one another is a learned behavior. We learn different languages by mimicry. If you think about how a young child first starts to speak, it often begins with mimicking sounds that they hear other people in their family saying. A 2-year-old doesn't know what the words mean, but they can create those sounds. And so the learned behavior part of that is learning how to create a particular kind of sound. The behaviors of organisms can both be selected for and against. Innate behaviors are oftentimes adaptive and help improve fitness, and learned behaviors are those that are going to help improve survivability and increase fitness as well. Finally, we have cooperative behaviors. Cooperative behaviors can be learned or instinctive. Cooperative behaviors also play a role in natural selection. It's easy for us to think about the variations that an individual has that might increase or decrease its fitness, but this can also apply to groups as well. It's not uncommon for groups of organisms that live in colonies, like insects, or familial groups to exhibit behaviors that increase the survivability or fitness of the entire group. We oftentimes define these behaviors as altruistic. Whether or not true altruism exists is subject to pretty rigorous debate. Kin selection is a form of altruistic behavior whereby animals engage in some behavior that decreases their own individual fitness, yet increases the fitness of their family members. We're going to take a look at a short video that's going to illustrate how kin selection works.
Altruism, or behaviors that benefit others at the expense of oneself, have been observed in non-human primates as well as other animals. Such behaviors among primates include grooming, alerting others to danger, sharing food, caring for siblings, and providing support during violent confrontations. Grooming, for example, benefits the recipient's health by removing dirt or insects and reducing anxiety. However, the time spent grooming is costly to the groomer because it takes time away from important activities such as gathering food, caring for offspring, watching for predators, or attracting mates. These benefits and costs can have significant fitness consequences for both individuals involved. How could behaviors that decrease the reproductive success of an individual evolve in the first place? Why be nice? One mechanism for the evolution of altruism is called kin selection. Kin selection is the selection for a behavior even if it reduces the fitness of the actor because it increases the fitness of the relatives who share their genes. Meet Sue. Sue received half of her genetic material from her mother and half from her father. Sue shares approximately 50% of her genes with her full brother. Her half-sister shares 25% of her genes, as does her aunt and both of her grandparents. Sue shares 12.5% with her first cousin. In many primate social groups, males often leave once they reach maturity, but females remain for the majority of their lives. Most of the interactions in these groups is between close relatives. Let's suppose that Sue and several other individuals, including many of her relatives, are out collecting food when Sue sees a leopard heading towards the group. Sue calls out an alarm to warn the other monkeys. Unfortunately, the leopard focuses in on the noisy Sue while Sue's companions run to safety. If the leopard catches Sue, she will not be able to pass on her genes to the next generation. However, many of the individuals that survived the cheetah encounter are related to Sue, which increases the chance that they carry the allele for this altruistic behavior. Even though Sue may not survive to reproduce, her genes will be passed on through her relatives' offspring.
So that concludes topic 8.1. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.